Good morning and welcome to all of you for this our eighth session of Islamic Architectural Legacy course. I want to say one line: those who are present on time, so they are most welcome. For what others, I can't say here. So yes, please, Nasreen ji, I request to Nasreen madam, please start our today's session.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our Islamic architecture course again. I'll just share my screen. So my screen is visible, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So today's session for day 8, I have divided into two parts, part 1 and part 2. So part 1, we will continue with the last day's session, that is Ottoman's architecture. And part 2 will be Mughal architecture. So I have taken Agra as an example, Taj Mahal. So here we'll start with the part 1. Here we will look into Ottoman's chief court architect, Sinan, his works. So here, for the objectives, I have some questions. We will try to answer these questions. We will try to look into these the answers for these questions in this session. So, what does the term decorum mean when it is applied to architecture? So, in what ways was architectural decorum informed social and territorial hierarchies in the Ottoman Empire? Then how did a sultanic mosque differ from a mosque commissioned by a queen or maybe a princess or maybe vizier in terms of its architectural layout and features? So what were the innovations Sinan introduced into the Ottoman architectural idea? So these are some questions. We will try to find answers for these. But before that, we will just look into a little bit of historical context. So in the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire, as we understood, it became highly centralized, bureaucratized, and institutionalized in this particular period. So in this period, Sinan built mosques in Istanbul for patrons from upper echelons of the ruling elite. Through his mosques, he reshaped the cityscape of the capital and enhanced its imperial image. So after the reign of Mehmed II, the Kul system became crucial for the centralized administration. So here the Kul system means it's an institution that prevented the formation of rival aristocratic families that could challenge the Ottoman royal family. So after the consolidation of this Kul system under Mehmed II, sultans began to marry concubines of slave origin. So thus, both the royal family and the ruling elite comprised of multi-ethnic group, and they had high-ranking officials from these Kul backgrounds. So here, members of the royal family were the main patrons of chief architect Sinan. So here, let's understand a little bit of architectural decorum. So in the 16th century Ottoman world, architectural patronage increasingly conformed to hierarchical norms of decorum. So the relative social status of patrons, both male and female, determined the types of monuments appropriate for their patronage. Likewise, the decorum was calibrated according to the relative status of the sites of monuments, whether it is at the center or maybe at the periphery of the empire. So the social and territorial status hierarchies determined the plan type and what should be the scale and also the materiality of that particular building. So Sinan's architecture codified these norm of decorum in a very systematic fashion. So the concept of decorum also shaped the hierarchies among mosques Hence, there were differences in status, signs used in mosque commissioned by the sultans. So their queens, also daughters, grand viziers, and officers of lesser rank, and also merchants. So mosques built by the sultans in Istanbul and in also provincial towns also confirmed differing norms. For example, if you take only the sultans could build a monumental mosque with 2 or more minarets featuring multiple galleries and having marble paved forecourt with a central fountain. Other sultanic status signs included monumental scale, large domes, and precious building materials and ornaments. So in this session, by way of comparing selected mosque complexes designed by Sinan for all these patrons of different social ranks and in different locations of the empire, we will try to uncover the norms of decorum that were codified during his long tenure as chief court architect. So here we can compare the plans of mosques complexes of Sultan Suleiman in Istanbul and also one in Damascus. So both of them were designed by Sinan, architect Sinan. This shows the hierarchy between the center and the periphery of the empire. So this was the capital. Istanbul was the capital, so this became a center place. And then Damascus was at the periphery. So the Damascus complex has a symmetrical layout. Here you can see it has a symmetrical layout, and at the center you can see the modest mosque over here, and it is a cube with hemispherical dome raised on 4 pendentives. So its domical superstructure lacks half domes, so you can't see any half domes over here, and also there are no exedras. Exedras means they are the semicircular arches. So the mosque small scale differs from the monumentality of Suleymaniye mosque in the imperial capital. So in the imperial capital, you can see here, you can see 4 minarets with 10 galleries at this particular mosque, which is in Istanbul. But in mosque in Damascus has only 2 single galleried minarets. The complex in Damascus was built on an open field along the Barada river front. Here you can see the Barada river front. So where the pilgrims gathered before leaving for the Hajj, that is pilgrimage to Mecca. So under the leadership of the city's governor, the mosque complex has elite guest rooms. It also has hospice with cafeteria and 2 caravanserais with stables, and there is a madrasa with a arasta. Arasta means it's a street flanked by shops. It was added later on this complex. So this was financed by the surplus income from the Sultan's Waqf funds. So here, the device of Sinan to monumentalize small mosques was to add wider double rows, what you can see here, colonnades in front of them, as seen in the Suleymaniye Mosque of Damascus. So the colonnades are wider with respect to narrow facade of the cubical prayer hall, and the use of precious marble colonnades was a major status symbol, as was the lead cover dome, and also the dome and also the slanted eaves. So this was the element Sinan used to use to show the monumentality effect for smaller mosques. So here you can see the stripped masonry, which was common in southeastern Anatolia and Syria. You can even see that in this particular mosque. So here local masons and decorators were employed for the construction of the mosque designed by Sinan, and its construction was supervised by architects sent from the capital. So the stripped masonry and the polychrome marble paneling at the interior exemplifies the interaction with the local masons and regional decorative idea. So if you see the example of Mamluk buildings of Damascus, they were decorated with colored marble cut in panels. So this Ottoman complex combines marble paneling with underglaze painted imitation Iznik tiles produced in a Damascus workshop that provided tiles for later Ottoman mosques as well. So here we'll take an example of Hurrem Sultan's complex in Istanbul, which was constructed in 1539 to 41. So she was Ukrainian wife of Sultan Suleiman. So Hurrem Sultan was also known as Roxelina, and she was the first woman who commissioned a mosque in Istanbul. So previously only the sultans and high rank viziers and all used to commission mosques at the heart of the capital. So Hurrem's special status as Suleiman's only wedded wife enabled her to construct her own complex in this prestigious part of the city. So the mosque is a cube covered by a single hemispherical dome, and later domed extensions were added in 1622 with surplus income what she had from her Queen's Waqf fund. The mosque has one single galleried minaret, and its modest scale reflects the status of its patrons. So even though the mosque is small, the complex provided extensive public charities. It comprises of a Friday mosque, hospice, madrasa, and also an elementary school. And also it had a hospital. And it is located at Avrat Bazaar, that is a market for women area. So special women's market was set up there on certain days of the week. This adds a gendered layer to her patronage. So here you can see the picture of Hurrem Sultan, and this particular site also had Byzantine imperial associations. This was the forum of Arcadius earlier, with a historiated triumphal column at its center. So the 5-domed brick portico supported on 6 white marble columns is fronted by an octagonal ablution fountain here. In contrast to the Sultanic mosques, which were built in ashlar masonry, Hurrem complex is constructed with an alternating courses of stone and brick. And this was much cheaper, and also it was modest. So in contrast to the domes of Shahizadeh, Mehmed and Suleymaniye mosques raised on appendices, the dome of this particular mosque features shell-shaped squinches. So here you can see the shell-shaped squinches. The interior of the mosque is dimly lit, and its stone portal has an archaic look. So coming to the next complex, that is Uskudar complex of Mother Queen, that is Mother Nur Banu Sultan. Nur Banu Sultan was the chief wife of Suleiman's son and successor of that is Selim II. Being a Venetian, she was known as the Venetian Sultana. She gave birth to Murad III, and having outlived her husband Selim II, she acquired a higher status of Queen Mother. So as the mother of reigning Sultan Murad III, she retroactively became the carrier of royal blood. So her mosque complex is located in the Asian part of the Istanbul, and it is a vast roadside complex that would answer the needs of pilgrims and also merchants with its dependencies offering different public services. So unlike Hurrem, who died as the wife of a sultan, Nur Banu became the mother of a sultan. Hence, compared to Hurrem's humble mosque complex, that of Nur Banu. So this exhibits status signs associated with the royal family. So thus the patronage of royal women was not unified. Instead, it too was stratified according to the social ranks among royal women. So the mosque is built in ashlar masonry again, and looks like a royal grand vizierial mosque. The second galleried minaret and a 5-bay portico were probably added to the design after she became the queen mother. So the domes of mosques built by her daughter and Princess Mehruma surpasses her own mosque in terms of size, because the construction of her mosque started when she was the wife of a Selim II. If she commissioned this mosque when she became a queen mother, the complex would have been more monumental. So here coming to the next complex, that is Uskudar complex of Mehruma Sultan. She is Mehruma Sultan, was the only daughter of Sultan Suleiman and Hurrem Sultan. She commissioned 2 mosques complexes from Sinan, and she was the first princess to commission mosque complexes at the capital. Her first complex in Uskudar was built when her husband Rustam Pasha, he became the Grand Vizier of Suleiman. So the mosque has a central dome surrounded by 3 half domes. It has single gallery. You can see that better with the plan. So here you can see the plan of that. It has a central dome with 3 half domes, and it has a single galleried twin minarets. The 5-dome portico is surrounded on 3 sides by a second portico. So it also had second portico here. So thus a double portico is created, which makes the mosque facade wider and also more monumental. The square pavilion functioning as a ablution fountain jets out from the middle of the double portico. So Sinan designed it similar to a seashore pavilion, providing views to the city and sea to its users. So Mehruma's complex has an elementary school. She also had madrasa, and now the caravanserai, what she had earlier, that is lost. None of the buildings which were sponsored by royal women have paved forecourts with fountains like Sultanic mosques. So Uskudar Mosque resembles a shore palace with its view commanding double portico composed of marble columns and its projecting fountain pavilion. The fenestration of the mosque provides ample light to the interior space, and this might be read as a symbolic evocation of her name. That is, Mehruma means literally means sun and moon. So the light-filled bright space of the mosque is like a paradise, and the central dome is surrounded by 3 half domes. So coming to the next complex, that is Shehzade Mehmed complex in Istanbul again. So Sultan Suleiman had commissioned this mosque from Sinan for his son and heir apparent, that is Shehzade. Shehzade means Prince Mehmed in 1543. So who died at a young age. His mother here, Hurrem Sultan, also actively participated in the construction process. Even she used to visit the building while construction and all. So that the deceased prince was destined to become a next or thereafter. The mosque consists of 2 square space, forecourt with a central fountain. It has 2 minarets with double galleries. The forecourt superstructure is the predecessor. The mosque's dome is surrounded by 4 half domes. The central dome is higher and wider than that of Princess Mehruma mosque, the crown prince. So the interior space of the Shehzade mosque is perfectly centralized, as you can see here, and Sinan creates a more unified space by eliminating the lateral tiles and granite columns of previous Ottoman Sultanic mosques. So the next one is Idarni-Kapi complex of Mehruma Sultan. Here, Princess built this mosque complex as a widow after her Grand Vizier husband Rustam Pasha died and left her a vast fortune. So it is sited on a hilltop, so next to the city gate that leads to Idarni. So as we have seen, hilltops were reserved for only royal complexes. The siting of this mosque complex therefore highlights the enormous prestige of the princess as the only daughter of Suleiman who had lost his wife. So here the forecourt is exclusively used in the mosque of ruling sultans is included in Mehruma's complex here. Sinan introduced an architectural trick, that is, he combined the mosque's 7-domed portico with a U-shaped madrasa, and the space in between was planted as a garden featuring a central fountain pavilion. As such, the unpaved forecourt functions as the garden shared by the madrasa and mosque. And the half domes are eliminated here in this building, and instead a large single dome rises over 4 fenestrated tympanum arches. So here you can see the tympanum arches and a single dome. Its superstructure diverges from the pyramidal silhouettes of Suleymaniye and Shehzade Mehmed mosques designed by Sinan. So this is the forerunner of the single-domed Selimiye mosque in Idarni, which Sinan subsequently built for Mehruma's reigning brother, that is Selim II, in 1568 and 1574. So the mosque facade, which are freed from the cascade of domical elements, are taller and transformed into fenestration transparent screens. The Qibla wall is almost completely transparent, and in comparison to the previous mosques of Mehruma, this one is brighter and has much more unified interior space. The interior space is entirely legible from the mosque's exterior facades also. So the elimination of the 2 half domes that flank the central dome of the Suleymaniye creates a more light-filled interior space at Mehruma's mosque. So 4 tympanum arches are pierced with windows that bathe the interior with light. The princess mosque makes a cross-reference to her father's Suleymaniye mosque. The design of the triple arches that support the lateral tympanum in both buildings is strikingly similar. So in both mosques, these lateral arches are supported by colossal red granite columns that are spoliated. So through this conspicuous cross references, the Princess Mosque announces her royal prestige. So next, coming to Rustam Pasha's mosque in Istanbul, built in 1561 to 63. She constructed this after her husband's death. Rustam Pasha was a Croatian from Bosnia who rose to the rank of Grand Vizier during the reign of Sultan Suleiman as the ruler's son-in-law. So the mosque is located at the commercial port of the capital along the Golden Horn. So this is the Golden Horn. It is again a single-domed mosque with double portico raised on top of a basement with shops. The mosque is surrounded by shops and also warehouses belonging to its waqf. It is situated directly below the Suleymaniye complex in the city's panoramic silhouette. The location of both buildings expresses the hierarchy between the Sultan and his Grand Vizier. The Suleymaniye, which was sponsored by the highest-ranking person in the empire, dominates the complex of his late Grand Vizier here. So, unlike Suleymaniye, the interior walls of Rustam Pasha's mosque and its main facade are entirely covered with Iznik tile revetments. So this ornament profusion brings the funerary mosque close to a palatial pavilion or a mausoleum. Mosque's dome, raised on an octagonal zone of transition, foreshadows the octagonal baldachin of Selimiya Mosque in Edirne. So here you can see some patterns from Rustam Pasha's mosque in Istanbul. And here are some patterns replicated by not of any Ottomans, but one of our participant, architect Richa Raut. So as a day 7 assignment, she has done this assignment. So very beautifully composed and replicated. And she has tried to do that in a PowerPoint presentation. I just thought, why don't I just project you all her work. So as I'm showing the same Rustam Pasha's mosque over here. So next, coming to Shemsi Ahmed Pasha's complex, Uskudar in 1580. So Shemsi Ahmed Pasha was the descendant of a dynasty that once ruled an Anatolian principality. So raised in the Ottoman court, he became a vizier here. So his modest mosque complex was built next to his residence at the edge of the water. His mausoleum is here, you can see his mausoleum is attached to the mosque like a projecting shore pavilion. The inscriptions on the mausoleum asks prayers from those who pass by the boat. So to open up the views to the sea, Sinan eliminated one of the wing of the U-shaped madrasa, and whose garden is shared with the mosque, hence creating a L-shaped madrasa here. So the mosque enters into visual dialogue with surrounding buildings, particularly the mosque above it, that is that which was built by Rum Mehmed Pasha, a Grand Vizier of Mehmed II. So this juxtaposition highlights the differing styles of each period. So this small complex shows Sinan's skill in creating unique architectural designs in harmony with nature and the city's topography. So coming to Selimiya complex in Edirne in 1568 to 74. So Sinan created his masterpiece in Edirne, which dominates the highest hilltop of the city, like a city crown. So it was located on a significant route. Travelers arriving from Europe to the empire would first encounter the Selimiya complex before reaching the capital Istanbul. So many theories have been proposed for the patron's choice of Edirne as the construction site of his mosque complex here. So Edirne was the previous capital of the empire. Since the inhabitants of the city supported Selim II's candidacy for throne, he continued his relationship with the city throughout his reign. So the Ottoman sultans generally commissioned buildings before going to a military campaign. So it was just before the conquest of Cyprus that Selim II commissioned this complex. The mosque was financed with a share of the sultan from the booty of his campaign. So the Selimiye's interior is legible from its exterior. The single dome is the most dominating element of mosque, both internally and also externally. So the spatial unity of the interior is achieved by the subordination of all architectural features to the dome. The middle of the mosque under the dome is marked by a raised platform for the chanters of Holy Quran. So the square platform below the dome, it also had 3 ogee-shaped wooden arches on each side. The polychrome paintings preserved on the arches are derived from manuscript illumination and match the carpets dominated by red. So the painting against the red background consists of palmette with the saz leaves and also Chinese cloud bands. The naturalistic floral patterns and branches with spring blossoms on the tile panel are again designed specifically for these arc spandrels. As such, the tile makers must have received drawings of the surfaces for which they prepared custom-made tile panels. So these ceramic tiles show the addition of red to the blue, turquoise, and white color palette of Iznik tiles in this period. So all the three early modern empires, that is Ottoman, Safavids, and Mughals, invented their own distinctive floral decorative ideons. So here you can see Peter Dura technique, which we come across in Mughal period. So in contrast to the late medieval aesthetics of the Timurid Turkmen, Mumluk and Nasrid courts, geometric decoration was marginalized in this period. So this session of the part one, I'm going to end now. These are the list of topics we have finished. So in the next class for the day 9, we have Safavid Isfahan under Shah Abbas. Then we also have one more topic, that is international trade and the Safavid Shah's silk monopoly. And on the day 10, we will have legacies of Islamic architecture in the modern and contemporary era from 18th to 21st century. So in this session, we are going to invite one of the famous architect from Middle East, and he will be projecting his contemporary designs on Islamic architecture. So here, I have one assignment for you all, that is, now you have seen so many different types of domes until now, right? Right from day 1 to today. That is domes on pendentives, domes on shell-shaped squinches, domes on mukharnas, domes on tympanum arches, and also you have seen domes are abutted with two half domes or maybe 3 half domes, also 4 half domes. So try to find out all these type of domes, what we have learned until now, right from the Umayyad until the Mughals, and try to sketch all these domes. Try to sketch the construction detailing, and also you can write the monument name, which in which particular mosque this particular dome is being constructed. So no need to sketch the entire building, just the dome and its construction detailing, and label all the parts. Okay, so just you can do freehand kind of sketches for this. So now we will start with the new session, that is part 2. So here we'll understand in the part 2, Taj Mahal in Agra, the mausoleum as eternal garden. This is the Taj Mahal, and here you can see the river Yamuna. So for this session, I have some objectives. Here we will uncover the multi-layered meanings of Taj Mahal, a major Mughal monument from the mid-17th century, which has been understood in general as an expression of the undying love of Mughal ruler Shah Jahan for his wife Queen Mumtaz. So we'll try to find the answer for these questions, like what was the significance of the complex for the creation of a commercial quarter in the city, and what are the roles of the usage of the Char Bagh garden type, the Hasht Bihisht plant type, and also we'll try to understand the specific materials and decorative motifs in producing such architectural meanings and symbolism. So before understanding these questions, we'll understand some useful terms. Char Bagh means it's a 4-partite garden, a cross-axial 4-part garden divided by paved walkways or water channels. Darwaza means it's a gateway. Hasht Bihisht means 8 paradises, a plant type that consists of central dome at the center, having which is surrounded by 4 rooms in 2 superimposed stories, adding up to 8 rooms. So we will understand this plan. And also there is a term called Peter Dura. So Peter Dura means it's an inlay technique of hard or precious stones into marble, which was developed in Florence and transmitted to Mughal court. So here let's understand a little bit of historical context. Mughal Empire was founded in 1526 in the Indian subcontinent. The Mughals descended from the Timurid dynasty, which had been founded by Tamerlane in 13th century. So if you remember our last session, previous sessions of Timurid dynasty, then you can understand like how Timur was the grand, he was the great grand father of Babur, and he ruled much of Iran and Central Asia. The founder of this Mughal dynasty was Prince Babur, and he moved with his followers from Samarkand via Kabul into India after he lost Samarkand to invading Uzbek rulers of Central Asia. So as a minority, the Mughals ruled in the subcontinent multi-ethnic, multi-confessional and multi-linguistic population. So in order to legitimize their rule, they highlighted their descent from Timur. So Shah Jahan's reign, which started in 16th century, is termed as it's glorified as a golden age in contemporary Persian sources. Here, regulation of the court life and ceremonies, as well as the increasing formalization of the court arts are observable in this period. So during his reign, art and architecture became significant instrument expressing Mughal state ideologies. So Shah Jahan exerted control not only over the court and administration, but also he closely supervised court artists. The Mughals deployed marriage as a tool to establish political alliances with noble families of India and also from Iran. So in 1612, Shah Jahan married Arjumand Banu Begum. Later she was known as Mumtaz Begum. She was granddaughter of Itimad ad-Dawla, an Iranian officer at Akbar's court, and the daughter of Shah Jahan's vizier Asaf Khan. Mumtaz died in 1631, and her mausoleum, the Taj Mahal, is a monumental funerary garden which is sponsored by Shah Jahan. The Mughals continued the tradition of building grandiose dynastic tombs, emulating those of their Timurid ancestors in Central Asia and also in Iran, as well as aiming to surpass the tombs former Muslim rulers in the Indian subcontinent. So here you can see the aerial view. This is the complex, and this is the Taj Mahal, and then you can see the river. So this monument was integrated into the existing layout of Agra, dominated by riverfront pavilions. In 1526, when first Mughal ruler, that is Babur, he ruled from 1483 to 1530. He consolidated his political power in India, and he made Agra as his capital along this river Yamuna. So that time it was called as Jumna. Beginning with Babur, the Mughals created gardens, and Babur brought with him the Timurid garden tradition. And Agra thereafter became like it was developed as a riverfront garden city. The river linked the gardens to each other, and whose pavilions and tombs are accessible from the riverside boats also. The gardens lining the river on both sides contained the residences of the Mughal imperial family and the high-ranking nobles. So walled gardens with their paradisic connotations served as residences of the Mughal elites and also as the site of their tombs. So here you can see the location of Taj Mahal and its complex. So this is an old map of Agra in 18th century. And here you can see the waterfront gardens, how they have represented here. And then you have here, this is the complex Taj Mahal along the river, Jamuna river. So here we will understand what is Char Bagh, that is 4-partite garden. So here let's understand these locations. So this is the Isa Khan's tomb garden, and this is Bu Halima's tomb garden. Then here is the Arab Cereal Bazaar and gateways. Then number 4, here you have the Afzalwala tomb and a mosque. Then this is the Babar's tomb, and this one is Neela Gumbad. So Babar, when he came to India, he brought the Timurid garden tradition with him, and he refers to his first garden at Agra as a Char Bagh, that is literally 4-partite garden. So here this is called as a Char Bagh. The term often designates a cross-axial 4-part garden with subdivisions into smaller quadrangular plots lined by paved walkways and also many water channels you can see here. So the term also refers to gardens with a single central water channel subdivided into again quadrangular plots. So at the center of the garden, a pavilion or maybe a tomb or maybe a pool might be formed. The second Mughal ruler, that is Humayun, in 1508 to 1556, he ruled. His funerary garden complex is a monumental example of this type with its central tomb raised on a high platform. The waterfront garden of the Taj Mahal, what you can see here, is a variant of the Char Bagh. So here the main building is not located at the center, but rather on an oblong terrace. So here you can see this is the Char Bagh, and Taj Mahal is located on a oblong terrace. So it's not at the center over here, along the river front. So thus the main building is visible, directly accessible from the river side. The tomb terrace is fronted by a square 4-partite garden whose 2 main axes intersect to the center, marked by a water tank over here. So this is a view of Taj Mahal funerary complex. The Taj Mahal funerary complex lies on the bank of river Yamuna, as we know, and it is located on the southern edge of the city. The complex exhibits geometrical planning and symmetry. Its rectangular plan comprises a number of buildings and structures with different functions. The overall layout of the complex is subdivided into 2 rectangles that alternate with 2 squares. So you can see here 2 rectangles. These are the 2 rectangles with 2 squares alternating. The 4-partite square at the south end of the complex is a bazaar composed of 4 caravanserais. So this square unit is adjacent to a rectangular forecourt. So this is the Jalal Khana, which provides access into the tomb garden. So with a monumental portal, this is a monumental portal. So the bazaar was a significant component of the complex, even though today it has only survived partially, its components replaced with modern structures. Here the rectangular forecourt, that is Jalal Khana, is composed of again 4 courtyards. And also there was a bazaar street. So 2 of these courtyards contain gardens and each with a smaller domed octagonal tomb for Shah Jahan's 2 other wives. The 2 remaining courtyards over here, they have residential cells for tomb attendants. The Great Monumental Gate. So this is the Great Monumental Gate, provides access into the Char Bagh preceding the Taj Mahal. One of its central axes ends into 2 garden wall pavilions. The mausoleum of Mumtaz is situated on a oblong terrace, which is flanked by mosque. So here you can see the mosque and also an assembly hall towards the other end. So the higher square terrace of the Taj Mahal rises at the center of its lower rectangular terraces. Here you can see the Taj Ganj, that is the square unit at the south end of the complex, now occupied by houses. It was called as Taj Ganj before, or Taj Market. So it consisted of 2 cross-axial open bazaar streets and 4 caravanserais courts before. The establishment of the Taj Mahal complex made this area the main commercial suburb of Agra. So outside the complex, local and European merchants built their houses and caravanserais. This suburban area surrounding the complex became to be known as Mumtazabad, or the city of Mumtaz. So during the construction of the complex places, places had been appointed for the streets, shops, dwellings, and also the emperor commanded the merchants and also the shopkeepers and artisans to inhabit in this area, in this Tajganj. So here you can see a partially survived gate which provided access to the northwestern caravanserai. And this is a south gate and the Tajganj, what you can see over here. So the Tajganj is a grand bazaar consisting of large courts, all surrounded by porticos, under which chambers for the use of merchants were found. So an enormous quantity of cottons were sold here. The existence of this commercial area proves that the complex was the urban project meant to promote long distance trade. So here you can see the commercial area, and also you can see the 2 tombs, one here and one over here. That were the emperor's 2 other wives' tombs, which also were constructed with the dome was constructed with white marble and red stone. And these subsidiary tombs are dominated by a much larger central dome of Mumtaz Mahal, expressing her higher status. So this is the Great Gate, or the Darwaza-e-Roza, main gate, provides access from the forecourt into the funerary garden of Mumtaz Mahal. So its facade is clad in red sandstone and white marble. It is the first place where one encounters white marble with inlay of semi-precious stones in the Pietra Dura technique. So this particular word, means hard stone. It's an Italian word. The technique was also called as parchinkari in Persian. The only other places in the complex where this kind of technique is seen is mausoleum of Mumtaz Mahal. The inlaid Quranic inscriptions over here, they invite the visitors into the Garden of Paradise. So the galleries with double arcades flank both sides of the gate. One of these galleries was where free food was distributed to the poor. The income from generous charitable Waqf endowment established by Shah Jahan. So hence the tomb complex provided public charities in the name of dead queen. So here you can see one more view from inside the Charbagh of the Great Gate. So here you can see 2 identical garden wall pavilions that are located axially at the Charbagh, preceded by an arm of water channel. So these are those 2 locations. So these were the residential gate pavilions known as pseudo gates. So they look like gates but do not provide any access from inside or from outside. So they function as residences for honorable guests. So here, this viewpoint from inside this particular main gate, through the pointed arch of this Great Gate, the Taj Mahal is seen from a central perspective viewpoint. Even though the ground plan of the tomb originated from Central Asia and Iranian palatial models, the Pietra Dura floral ornaments and the proportions of the Taj echo the European Baroque aesthetics here. Here you can see the aerial view of Charbagh, which shows the otherworldly designs of the garden with its 2 water channels, which are intersecting at a central square pool. Contemporary authors often refer to it as a paradise-like garden, likening its water tank to the Kauthar. Kauthar means it's mentioned in Holy Quran that water, what is available in heaven, that's called Kauthar. The planted green paths have inlays in red sandstone with star motifs recalling the typical borders of carpet. So here you can see the view of the central water pool. And this is one more view looking towards the main gate. Visitors usually approach the mausoleum from two small gates with staircases that lead up to the cast white marble paved platform, so on which the Taj Mahal is located. And also the platform marked on four corners with cylindrical towers. So they also have some staircases which goes to view at the below crypt. So control of light. So only one tiny door provides access into the dimly lit interior of the tomb chamber. All other openings of the arches and windows are covered with carved marble grills, that is known as jalis, through which light enters in a controlled manner, giving the interior space a sanctified aura. So by contrast, palatial pavilions with the hushed behisht plan in Iran and the Deccan have completely open Ivans from which one can see the gardens, thereby blurring the distinction between the interior and exterior. The translation of this palatial building type into a tomb in the Taj Mahal was accompanied by its transformation into an inwardly looking sacred space. So all over the gardens are paths inlaid with star patterns, which enhance the idea that this is an otherworldly landscape. So the lower and upper terraces of the rectangular platform along the river front provide enchanting views of the river Yamuna and the Agra landscape. Both ends of the lower platform are abutted by multi-layered octagonal palatial tower pavilions, providing panoramic vistas. So framing one end of the same platform is the red sandstone mosque with triple white marble domes and inlaid motifs. So these include permanent prayer carpet motifs on the floor and which are fixed on the stone. And you can see a pointed arch mihrab is modest in scale and once again highlighted with white marble like here you can see a mimbar at its right featuring 3 steps. At the other end of the same platform is a symmetrical triple domed assembly hall, which is also called as Musafir Khana. So probably it was meant for Sufi recitations and all. So here let's understand what is Hasht Bihisht kind of plan. So Hasht Bihisht means it's 8 paradises. Is a centrally planned palatial pavilion that is found from Samarkand, Tabriz, and Istanbul to the Deccan. So this is like a cross axial Hasht Bihisht plan, and it consists of square corner. You can see this is a square, and the corners of which are cut, and this gives irregular octagon on 4 corners. So at the center, you can see one more octagonal domed chamber, and the 4 corners features 2-storied vaulted rooms. All these. The central chamber is connected to these. This particular central chamber, it's connected to all these 4 subsidiary spaces and the 4 central Ivans. So these are the Ivans, 4 central Ivans. So 8 corner rooms surrounding the central domed hall, forming the 9th dome as a heaven, represent the 8 paradises, that is Hasht Bihisht. So this plan type was first translated into the tomb of the Mughal Emperor Humayun in Delhi. So here you can see the similar kind of plan type. Here the tomb's central space is surrounded by continuous corridor, and this corridor was used as circumambulation rituals practiced during tomb visitation ceremonies. So here you can see this Hashtbhisht plan type for Taj Mahal. So here also Taj Mahal, you can see the central octagonal space, domed space, and then you have 4 octagons with the double heights. So totally 8 chambers you will have here, and this is a central crypt area. So this also had 4 Ivans. So this is the Hashtbhisht, the kind of plan, what you can see in the Taj Mahal. Here you can see the double shell dome. It's a tradition of Iranian architecture, was further developed under Timurids with increasingly higher outer shells. So this is a higher outer shell. In the Taj Mahal, the outer dome is almost taller than the central hall of the building, covered in the inner dome. So you can see inner dome is a lesser height, outer dome is very bigger height. So the towering dome is visible from all over the city of Agra here. So understanding the cynotopes of Mumtaz and Shah Jahan, the cynotopes in the middle of the octagonal railing under the octagonal dome commemorates the queen. Shah Jahan's crypt was buried next to his wife as an afterthought by his son and successor Aurangzeb. So Shah Jahan likely planned a separate tomb for himself, as all previous Mughal emperors were buried in tombs away from their wives. So Akbar, for example, is not buried with his wife. They each have separate tombs. Similarly, Jahangir and his wife Noor Jahan, they were buried in separate tombs in Lahore. And since the Taj complex is completely symmetrical, the fact that Shah Jahan's cenotape is awkwardly fitted here, and this shows the afterthought. It's not designed for this cenotape. The octagonal dome is echoed by the octagonal shape of the railing. So around the 2 cenotapes again, which like the railing are also having inlaid white marble with Peter Dura techniques here. So this is the upper chamber of the cenotape. So this is a typical Mughal royal tomb where the real bodies are buried in the ground level. So here you can see what you see on the upper level. It is not. It is just like a symbolic. So real cenotapes are in the underground, so in the lower chamber. So in order to visit these underground cenotapes of the crypt, one descends from the flight of stairs. So the crypt was opened once in a year on the death anniversaries of the emperor and the queen. So only very privileged household members were allowed to enter the crypt. So let's understand the aura of sanctity. So in order to evoke an aura of sanctity, various techniques were used in the Taj Mahal. That is the controlling of light via carved marble grills. It's a significant example here. And this creates a dimly lit interior space with an aura of sanctity. Also, the sanctity of the tomb chamber was further enhanced by Quranic recitations that took place 24 hours in the building by alternating teams of reciters stationed in the upper galleries. So let's understand about the inscriptions. This building has the largest number of Quranic inscriptions in the world. The inscriptions turn the Taj Mahal into a talking building. Many of the inscriptions address the visitors in the first-person voice of God. The building thus invites immersive interactions. So Arabic inscriptions are from Quranic verses with invitations to enter the garden of paradise, that is to enter the heaven, with pavilions under which rivers flow. So the rewards of paradise and the punishments of the hell are dominated themes of the inscriptions. So another theme is the promise of divine mercy during the last judgment to believers. So almost in all the Islamic architectural buildings, monuments, either it is a tomb or maybe it is a palace, or any kind of Islamic architectural monuments, you see the inscriptions. Most of the themes were like they're highlighting the paradise. They're talking about the good deeds, bad deeds, and then talking about mercy of God, something like that. So those are the usual concept behind writing these inscriptions. And also you can see dated signatures of the Iranian calligraphers, Amanat Khan of Shiraz, also found in various inscriptions of tomb and Great Garden Gate. So through which the completion dates of various parts of the complex can be deduced. So here let's understand the technique of Peter Dura. So artists and artisans such as stone cutters, stone carvers came from the construction of came for this construction from all over India. So Peter Dura, a technique that originated in Italy, especially in Florence, is the highly specialized form of inlay of hard or semi-precious stones into marble. Here you can see that technique. So the pieces of stone are fitted in the form of an image in a way that the joints between the thin pieces become invisible. The Mughals learned this technique from the European artists who were employed in their court. Yet the Mughal artists' works of Peter Dura surpassed the European examples in their floral designs. The cenotaphs and the surrounding screen in the dome chamber of the Taj Mahal are famous as most exquisite examples of Peter Dura. Even the inscriptions of the building are completely inlaid in that technique. For this reason, it took nearly more than 20 years to complete the whole complex. So understanding the white marble as a symbol of divine light. The main construction material of the Taj Mahal complex was brick, red sandstone, and white marble revetments. Red sandstone and white marble had a symbolic significance in Mughal architectural culture. So the historical sources refer to the Taj Mahal as illumined tomb, that is Rauza Munawwara. The idea of divine light found expression in the usage of luminescent white marble. The tomb is referred in poems as the descending place of the divine light and divine mercy. Therefore, it has a saintly aura with its dazzling brilliance. Built entirely of white marble, which is associated with the symbolism of light and divine illumination. The white marble exterior changes color according to the daylight, as seen over here. It also responds to the light. So Mumtaz Mahal becomes an intercessor on behalf of the tomb visitor who seeks the divine light and mercy. So the queen achieves almost a saintly status here, and this was a period in which Sufi mysticism was popular at the Mughal court. So here I'll end the part 2 session and today's session 2. I have told the assignment of the tomb, so you can refer the all the recordings until now to get this answer. So now I'll hand over the mic to Dr. Bhujan. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thanks a lot. And if there are any questions, then please welcome. अगर कुछ सवाल है तो chat box में लिखिए या फिर आप पूछ सकते हैं. Here in chat box there is no any question, so it means that everyone understood it. किसी को अगर कुछ सवाल है तो जरूर पूछे. मैं सिर्फ एक additional
he's doing lot of studies on Mughal architecture, so he's very much expert than me. So
thank
you
you.
can ask any questions to him.
Yes. How are we supposed to draw the domes? Aparna ji ने पूछा है.
So just
How are we
freehand
supposed
sketches,
to?
for example, you can show that in terms of plan, two-dimensional plans, or you can show that as a section, or maybe 3D sketch.
Just I want to add one information for all the participants. There is one unique manuscript regarding this Taj Mahal. It's called as the Tarikh-e-Taj, and it was wrote in 1699. And that manuscript is in my personal collection. And in future, maybe in within next 2-3 months, it will be published. And some more manuscripts related to this Mughal architecture style also are there. So nowadays we are busy in translating that all matter, and as it will be complete, we will publish it. Before of this, I was published two important manuscript. One is Chechnama, the complete manuscript copy which I have, and another is Tabkat-e-Akbari. So if you are interested, you can just put the name in Google. You will get the information. Or if you will not get, then please say to me. I can send it to you. So it's only for study purpose. Okay. Yes. Thank you. यहाँ हम कहाँ से देखकर बनाएंगे? उर्सेम लता जी ने पूछा है कि ये डोम का जो आर्किटेक्चर बना रहे हैं ये तो वो कहाँ देखकर बनाएंगे, ऐसा उन्होंने पूछा है।
हम लोगों ने बहुत सारे डोम्स के बारे में पढ़ा है ना अभी, फ्रॉम डे 1 to day 8. So today is the 8th day. So in all the recordings, you will find many different types of domes, right from the Umayyads. So in the Umayyads, also in Nasirid's periods. So like this, you just take some examples and you can just show different domes. So as I told, we have domes on squinches, we have domes on mukarnas, we have domes on these pendentives. So just take all these different types of examples and you can just sketch it.
If possible, can we make a small PPT about 8 slides only, or 8 to 10 slides? If possible, can we put all that domes, only the structure of dome in that PPT with the names of that particular dynasty? And if we will share its PDF file in our group, maybe it will useful for all.
Okay.
If possible, then
So
only.
here the importance is we are not looking into in which dynasty which kind of dome has come. So our main intention is to understand the construction technology.
Yeah.
So how those domes are constructed. That is main thing, to understand different types of domes. So just the construction detailing, if you can find, you can do it. I'll just give you some examples also, so that it will be easier for you to refer.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thanks a lot. And now the questions are also over. So tomorrow we will meet at the same time, and with the humble permission of all of you, now we will stop here and tomorrow meet. Thank you. Thanks a lot to all.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.